What if the only warm place for miles was also the most dangerous? What if stepping inside to escape the snow meant stepping into a human hell? And what if the fire you longed for was surrounded by enemies, not friends? This wasn't some horror story, it was real life for anyone unlucky enough to wander into a medieval winter inn. Picture this. A man named Tomlin trudging through a frozen wasteland. The wind howls like a banshee, the snow lashes at his face like icy needles, and the dirt path under his boots has turned into a solid strip of ice. He's soaked to the bone, starving, barely standing, when just beyond the foggy ridge he spots it, a flicker, a glow, a trembling little flame in the darkness. Could it be a roadside lodge? To us, that sounds almost cozy soft firelight, roasted meat, mulled ale. But for Tomlin, that distant glow was both a lifeline and a warning. What he was about to enter wasn't a haven, was a furnace of filth, smoke, and silent battles, a place where survival wasn't about escaping the cold, it was about surviving the people inside. Let's smash the fantasy of the charming, rustic medieval tavern. The truth? These places were like war zones dressed up as pubs. In the dead of winter, they weren't places of celebration. They were places of desperation. And for Tomlin and travelers like him, the so-called comfort came with a steep, dangerous price. After limping through the sludge and forcing open the snow-jammed door, Tomlin didn't feel warmth, he felt panic. The air hit him like a punch to the chest. Dense smoke swirled so thick it hung in the air like a sour fog. The room stank of mouldy cloth, rotting hay, wet feet, and something vaguely meat-like, if meat had been boiled in socks and left out for days. The hearth at the center belched smoke that clung to the low ceiling, refusing to rise or leave. It stabbed at Tomlin's lungs and made his eyes sting with tears. No clean air, no warm welcome, just a riot of coughing, shouting, and the acrid sting of too many unwashed bodies in one cramped room. If hell had a waiting room, this was it. There was no peaceful corner to hide in. The fire, everyone's salvation, was surrounded like a celebrity. A ring of bulky bodies guarded it like treasure. Tomlin's dream of thawing his fingers turned into a grim reality. There was no room for newcomers. Only the elite of this miserable little society got to bask in that golden glow. In the inner circle, closest to the flames, lounged the top dogs. Sir Beric the merchant lord, Yarn the scar-faced mercenary, a smug priest named Father Delvin, and a trio of armoured soldiers who looked like they'd rather stab you than share warmth. These weren't just warm, they were glistening. Heat rolled off them, their boots steaming, their laughter booming as they mocked those on the outside. They didn't just take the best seats, they owned them, either through coin, violence, or sheer arrogance. Behind them sat the middle class of the fire hierarchy. These were travelling artisans, grain sellers, or decently dressed farmers people like Nella the weaver or old Bartok the barrel maker. They sat farther out, trying to soak up the leftover heat from the wall or from the backs of the privileged. They laughed politely, tried not to shiver too loudly, and mostly hoped the real elite wouldn't notice them. Then there was the frozen fringe, the shadows, the unwanted, Tomlin's people, a miserable gaggle of peasants, beggars, and day labourers. Hunched near the wall by the draughty door, where the cold wind slipped in like a ghost, they didn't even try to be comfortable. Children cried, a woman sobbed quietly under a threadbare shawl, and a toothless old man tried to rub his hands together for warmth, only to cough until he almost collapsed. For these bottom-rung souls, warmth wasn't a luxury, it was a myth. They got the smoke, the stink, and the splinters of cold that sliced through every crack in the wall. Their eyes locked onto the hearth like hungry wolves, filled with longing and fury. But nobody moved. Nobody dared. The real shock was how normal this was. This wasn't a bad night. This was just how it worked. You didn't get warm unless you could pay, fight, or bully your way to it. Even indoors, the winter hadn't been defeated, it had simply been given rules, and those rules were cruel. The fire wasn't just heat. It was power. And in the medieval tavern, power didn't come cheap. So when people today wax poetic about the golden glow of a rustic inn, they're dreaming of a world that never existed. Because for Tomlin and the hundreds like him, the warmth of the hearth was only one small step away from the cold grip of death. He hadn't escaped the storm, he'd just traded it for a whole new nightmare. Imagine fighting to the death just to sit a little closer to a fire. Imagine warmth being rationed like gold, and stepping out of line meant a fist to the jaw. Now imagine, after winning that fight, your prize is a soup that smells like a swamp and tastes like regret. Welcome back to the nightmare called a medieval winter tavern. For people like Tomlin stranded in frost-covered clothes, his face burning from the cold, the tavern looked like salvation. But beyond that circle of flickering light and warmth, reality bit just as hard as the wind outside. For most guests, the tavern was no better than the frozen road. The walls might have blocked the snow, but they sure didn't block the misery. Every night was a savage little war. When a newcomer entered, they had to immediately scan the room like a soldier entering enemy territory. The cut of your coat, the dirt on your boots, the way others glared at you, these were your social resume. One wrong move, like easing into a spot by the fire you hadn't earned, and you'd find yourself on the floor, possibly with fewer teeth than you started with. Inside this suffocating hut of soot and smoke, warmth was more than heat, it was power. The hierarchy wasn't just visible, it was felt. You could feel the layers of dominance like rings around the fire. At the core, the warmest, sat the ruling class of this temporary world. Everyone else circled like satellites in the cold. Winter might have frozen the world outside, but it sure didn't freeze social order. That stayed intact, cruel and rigid. But even if you did claw your way close to the hearth, a new monster greeted you, the food, or should we say, the punishment that pretended to be food. The tavern's winter menu wasn't written on a chalkboard, it was etched in trauma. While in warmer months, there might be the occasional fish, some fresh veggies, or meat from a lucky hunter's kill, winter transformed the kitchen into a laboratory of suffering. Meals weren't made to be enjoyed, they were concocted to keep your shivering carcass moving. Ale was the go-to drink, not for the taste, but because it had calories. But even that betrayed you in winter. Stored in freezing cellars, the ale often turned into syrupy sludge with little snowflakes floating in it. Warming it by the fire only gave it a burnt caramel flavor if caramel had been made by demons. And to save money, innkeepers watered it down so much it became a bitter, yeasty puddle colder than the snow outside. The main course? A never-ending slop pot known as stew, but really just an ancient cauldron of despair. They never emptied it. They just kept tossing in new scraps on top of old ones. Today's meat? Last week's parsnips? Who could tell? It was a chunky grey goop made from dried peas, barley, rotting root vegetables, and turnips that looked like they'd survived a war. They boiled this mixture for hours, sometimes days, until it reached the consistency of old glue and the flavour of boiled misery. Meat? Ha! If it was available, it was either ancient salt pork from months ago, now as hard as stone and as salty as heartbreak, or it was something the butcher wouldn't even touch. On especially lucky days, a poacher might sneak in with a squirrel or a mangy pigeon, and into the pot it went bones, beak, feathers if no one was watching. The result was a cauldron that could either save your life or end your appetite forever. If the innkeeper was particularly frugal or sinister, they'd dump in meat from animals that had died of causes no one asked about: sickness, starvation, or mystery. To mask the smell of decay, they overseasoned with garlic, onions, and prayers. And bread? That was a crunchy jawbreaker made from whatever could be ground down coarse flour, bran, crushed peas, sometimes even acorns. You had to soak it in broth for 5 minutes just to chew without chipping a tooth. The taste? A combination of mold, dirt, and hopelessness. Staying at the inn for more than a few days meant you risked more than indigestion. With no fresh produce and no herbs, many travellers ended up with scurvy bleeding gums, loose teeth, the works. So while you were choking on salty rope meat and fermented sock water, your body was also quietly falling apart. And the air? Let's talk about the air. You didn't breathe in the tavern, you inhaled punishment. To trap every shred of warmth, innkeepers turned the building into an airtight tomb. Windows were shut with wooden slabs, sealed from the inside with filthy rags, old pelts, or mouldy sacks. Doors were stuffed with moss and soot, then hung with heavy curtains. It kept the heat in, and everything else. No air could circulate. The hearth, always burning, was fed with whatever they could find, not clean logs, but damp twigs, soggy peat, even dried animal dung. The smoke? It didn't go up. It went everywhere. The tiny vent in the ceiling wasn't enough. The room filled with a greasy, choking haze that stuck to your clothes, your skin, your tongue. Within an hour, your eyes burned, your throat stung, and your lungs itched with every breath. It wasn't just smoke, it was the fumes of wet wool, sweaty bodies, spilled ale, and bad breath. The ceiling dripped with sticky black soot that occasionally flaked off into the soup. At any given time, you might have been swallowing stew and ceiling. For people like old Mother Kren, who had been running her roadside lodge for decades, this was normal. She'd cough violently every morning, her voice rasping like broken glass. The regulars too, read Joe. Hook-eyed hacked and wheezed with every laugh. Bronchitis, eye infections, and lung rot were occupational hazards, not from cold, but from smoke. Soot coated everything, walls, floors, even faces. It slipped into lungs and never left. Guests would grow dizzy, groggy, and miserable. Carbon monoxide filled the room, though no one knew the word for it. They just called it bad air. But it poisoned people all the same. In the worst taverns, some didn't even wake up. They thought they'd survived the cold. They didn't know they'd stepped into something far worse. What's worse, freezing to death or choking on poison air? Would you trade ice on your skin for smoke in your lungs? In the twisted world of medieval winter taverns, that was the nightly decision: survive the cold or suffocate trying. Most travelers never truly slept. They passed out, coughed into oblivion, or slipped into unconsciousness so thick it was hard to tell if they were still breathing. Some didn't wake up. The only way to make the room slightly bearable was to crack open a door or window, but doing so was like inviting death inside. The moment cold air rushed in, it wiped out the fragile warmth everyone had fought so viciously to create. And so, night after night, they chose suffocation over the bite of frost. That sealed box of smoke and sweat began to consume them. Everyone inside breathed the same thick fog of misery soaked in smoke, burnt peat, and the stench of too many bodies pressed too close. But the smoke wasn't the only thing killing them. There were other guests, no ones who arrived only in the dead of winter. The roads were flooded with the desperate, drifters, outcasts, the penniless, and the forgotten. In summer, they slept under trees and stole crusts of bread. But in winter, they stormed into places like this, drawn to fire like insects to a lantern, bringing with them not just hunger, but disease, lice, and despair. Tomlin watched them arrive night after night. There was Bragg the Sootface, a failed farmer who hadn't seen a proper meal in a month. Patches the monk, reeking of ale, and kicked out of his abbey for preaching nonsense. And worse men with no names, just infected eyes and hacking lungs, their bodies raw with sores, fingers blackened by frostbite. These weren't just sad cases, they were dangerous. Men like that had nothing to lose. If you had a coin pouch or a slice of bread, you were a target. Violence was silent and sudden. A stolen satchel, a knife between ribs, a stranger gone in the night. Many of these wretches worked for scraps. The innkeeper, a mean woman named Gritta, would put them to work chopping firewood or cleaning muck from the stable in exchange for a scoop of flavourless stew and a corner to collapse in. The bed was rotting straw soaked with mildew, tucked right beneath a leaking window. Their hunger wasn't just in their stomachs, it was in their eyes. The envy for those with dry clothes, better food, or a spot closer to the fire hung in the air like another layer of smoke. Their silent hatred turned the room into a boiling pot of tension. Among the sick and broken were old ward dog-sex soldiers discarded after the latest border scrap, some with limbs missing, others with scars that never healed. They'd slam their mutilations on the table hoping for pity coins, and when those didn't come, they'd drink what was left of their pride. All of society's forgotten filth came crawling into the tavern during winter. Gutter monks, ex-convicts hiding from the rope, and peasants with sunken faces and scabbed skin. The common room was a dump site for every vice, disease, and sorrow the Middle Ages had to offer. It was the bottom of the social barrel, and it stank of rot. For a traveller with even a few coins, this was hell. One wrong look, one shiny buckle, one whisper of coin, and you became prey. Theft, threats, even murder for half a loaf wasn't just possible, it was routine. But the worst part wasn't the knives or the lice, it was the coughing. That sound echoed constantly wet, hacking, hollow coughs that came from deep in the chest, and with every bark of sickness came a flurry of invisible terror. What we now know as tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis in those days, they just called it consumption, and they consumed people quickly. One sick man, leaning against a pillar with fevered eyes and blood on his lips, could infect an entire room. The tavern was a breeding ground for plague-like spread. There was no medicine, no masks, no hand-washing, just one giant lung shared by everyone. Even the strong didn't stand a chance. Tomlin, already worn down by hunger and exhaustion, could feel his body slipping. He hadn't even caught the worst of it yet, but he could feel it in his chest, something foreign growing inside him, all because he'd chosen not to die in a snowbank. The tavern wasn't a shelter, it was a death trap. And yet, there was nowhere else to go. When the sun vanished around 4 o'clock, the true horror began. The nights were long, black, and endless. Time stretched on forever inside that suffocating room, and with nothing to do but survive the dark, things got wild. Boredom was a beast. It gnawed at people's minds more viciously than the cold, and when boredom mixed with cheap, lukewarm ale, the result was chaos. The number one distraction? Gambling. Dice games popped up in every corner. Old soldiers carried worn bones in their pockets, and even beggars had a set. They'd squat in a circle around a barrel or play right on the filthy floor. The bets were pitiful: some bread, a sip of drink, a stolen button, but the shouting could shake the rafters. And of course, someone always cheated, someone always got caught. Then came the shouting, the slaps, the overturned bench, the knives. You couldn't swing a mug without hitting 3 sore losers and a toothless drunk screaming bloody murder over a bad roll. Board games were no safer. 9 men's Morris, rough checkerboards, even scraps of parchment with primitive cards, they all ended the same way. Fists, fury, and furniture flying across the room. The air itself was a powder keg. Smoke, stink, frustration, and too many people jammed in too small a space. It pressed down on the mind like a weight. Even a spilled drink could start a war. A laugh at the wrong moment, a death sentence. No one slept easily. Even rest was dangerous. Because in that pitch-black hellhole, with the wind screaming outside and madness building inside, the true monster wasn't cold, it was each other. It always started with a song, rough, off-key, full of foul words or war chants belted out by someone drunker than the rest. Sometimes it was old Jerick with his rotten teeth clacking out a soldier's ballad from the Southern Wars, sometimes a blind beggar with lungs like a bull and no sense of timing. If the tune caught on, others would mumble along, tapping wooden mugs or stomping boots, but more often someone would shout, "Shut your gob," and the mood would snap like dry kindling. Fists flew over everything in those frozen hellholes, even taste in music. When voices weren't raised in brawls or ballads, they whispered stories. A ragged pilgrim might speak of distant shrines and miracles real or invented. A half-deaf soldier, face marked by scars and ash, would grumble of blood and betrayal on forgotten battlefields. A toothless villager spun ghost tales of lantern-eyed hags that stalked the swamp trails, their bony fingers scraping at window shutters on moonless nights. These stories, told by flickering firelight with the wind groaning against the timbers, only deepened the sense that survival here wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. You had to read the air, sense the shift in posture or tone that meant trouble was coming. Because danger didn't only wear human skin. It had hooves too. For a traveler, especially one with coin or cargo, his horse wasn't just a beast, it was his lifeline. A knight's stallion, a trader's draft mare, a messenger's lean gelding all meant the difference between moving forward and dying in the snow. Losing a horse in the dead of winter, miles from home, was more than a setback. It was ruin, maybe death. And yet, the stables attached to these roadside dens of misery were sometimes worse than the tavern itself. They weren't really stables, more like glorified sheds. Roofs that leaked with every snowfall, dirt floors turned to brown sludge, wind howling through loose boards. You'd find no warm straw beds, only frozen filth soaked in piss and dung, where the animals stood trembling on stiff legs. The smell alone could make a priest weep rot, ammonia, wet fur, and something sickly underneath, like slow decay. A good horse could fall sick in a night. Hooves rotted, chests wheezed. The acrid stench of stale hay or bran made from sawdust and mold clung to everything. If you were lucky, the innkeeper offered actual oats. If not, rotten barley or hay that twisted a horse's guts into knots. Some beasts died from it before sunrise. But it wasn't just disease or filth. No, the worst threat came on 2 legs. Thieves. Every night, shadows crept through the barn doors. The locks were jokes, loops of rusted iron or frayed rope. Stable boys, if they existed at all, were either drunk, asleep, or in on the heist. A slick pair of hands could slip in, unhitch the best steed, and vanish before the rooster crowed. Many a man woke up, boots on, sword beside him, only to find an empty stall. And if that horse was your trade, your guard, or your only chance to reach the next village alive, then it was over. And even if it didn't vanish, it might still die thanks to another silent killer disease. Sleeping sickness, hoof rot, lung blight. One infected animal could spread death to every beast under that sagging roof in a matter of days. Did the innkeeper care? No. He'd stable diseased donkeys next to prize horses if the coin clinked loud enough. No checks, no questions, just money on the table. So the smart ones, the poor, desperate, cautious ones would sleep with their animals. Not beside a warm hearth or under a roof of leaking beams, but curled up on a bed of sour straw next to their steed, breath visible in the freezing air. Better to freeze beside your horse than wake to find it gone or dead. You'd see them out there, wrapped in torn cloaks, a dagger tucked under one arm, shivering beside a noble creature that might be the last friend they had on earth. And while all this misery unfolded in the frozen dark, there was one man who sat above it all, one who held the keys to comfort and life itself, the innkeeper. He was the Fire Lord. In that bleak, smoke-choked world, warmth was king. Not ale, not meat, not shelter. Warmth. And the keeper of the fire ruled all. He decided how much heat you got, how close you could sit, and how long you could stay there. Not because he was cruel by nature, though most were, but because firewood, peat, and dung didn't grow on trees in January. Every log that burned was a calculation. Every spark was an investment. If he gave too much heat to one fool tonight, his own kids might freeze next week. But that practicality warped into something uglier, a performance. Because fire could be sold. The hearth never roared like a roaring blaze. It wheezed and crackled like an old man dying, smoky, damp, and choking. The fuel was whatever they could scrape together, rotting pine, moss-covered sticks, dung patties, peat soaked in snowmelt. And to sit by this miserable excuse for warmth, you had to pay. Coin bought inches. The richer you were, the closer you sat. The poorer, the further you got pushed out toward the icy corners where wind crept in and your breath turned to mist. When blizzards howled outside, the price of heat tripled. One mug of ale, same price as putting your boots to the fire for an hour. Want to lie close enough to feel your fingers again? Better have a silver. It became theatre, a show of status. A fat merchant would slap down a coin and smugly take the best bench by the flames, stretching his feet while a dozen froze. A group of rough soldiers wouldn't pay, they'd just shove others aside, laughing. A broke traveller might offer services, sweeping, wood chopping, mucking out the latrines. Or he'd perform. Tell stories, sing songs, dance like a fool just to earn a warm seat. If you had nothing, you were nothing. You sat in the third ring of cold, maybe further, right by the cursed door where wind sliced through every time someone entered. And in that brutal hierarchy, heat became a crown, a badge, a judgment. One's closeness to the hearth mirrored his place in life. Peasants crouched in corners, drunks and invalids huddled under tables. Rich men roasted. It was social order, written in flame and ash. And if the tavern had private rooms rare, elite, expensive, then fire became a luxury of royalty. To light a brazier inside, separate fee, astronomical fee. Want coals? Triple that. Warmth wasn't comfort anymore. It was power, security, a curtain against madness. If you could afford to sleep in a room with its own fire, you were practically a noble. The rest? They just hoped the cold didn't kill them before the morning did. If night was cruel, morning was pitiless. It came not like a gentle promise of survival, but as another blow. The world inside the tavern did not wake, it groaned back to life. Anyone who'd managed to sleep now dragged themselves upright like corpses reanimated by obligation, not rest. The fire, once the holy centerpiece of the common room, was now a blackened pit or, at best, a sad bed of grey embers. No heat remained. The air inside was as cold and cruel as the snow-swept roads outside, and twice as foul. Every breath scraped the throat like dry ice mixed with rotten meat. Grigg, the innkeeper, thick of hand and heart, knew exactly how helpless his guests were. He didn't sell firewood, he sold hope by the handful, and he priced it like gold. In his eyes, a half-frozen noble or a frostbitten merchant wasn't a guest. They were coins with legs. If they wanted a few inches closer to the hearth, they paid. If they wanted hot water, triple. This was no inn. This was a market of survival, where warmth itself was currency and compassion was extinct. And so, fights broke out, again and again. Not over ale, not over beds, over inches of warmth. Men shoved each other, barked threats, or raised fists just to defend a patch of lukewarm stone or a stool near a dying ember. Penniless wanderers, desperate to feel their toes again, lunged for space near the fire and were met with boots or tankards to the face. The tavern's economy wasn't just cruel, it was medieval capitalism at its worst. And it didn't just cost dignity, it cost lives. But the real horror wasn't the frostbite or the filth, it was what came after: morning. It crept in slowly, not with light, but with dripping frost. Ice crystals had formed on the ceiling through the night, fed by the rank breath and body heat of dozens crammed together like livestock. And now they melted. Slowly. Filthy, freezing drops fell on sleeping faces. People woke with curses, confusion, or shudders, as if the sky itself was weeping on them. The walls were slick. The floor turned to slime. The straw bedding they'd collapsed on the night before was now damp from breath, sweat, and half-melted snow. No one truly rose from their makeshift nests. They peeled themselves from the filth. Their joints cracked like old timbers, bodies stiff from the cold and the contorted sleeping positions forced on them by lack of space or broken cots. Every limb moved like it had rusted overnight. Their clothes were wet, not soaked, but just enough to stick to skin like death's embrace. Shirts were damp from neck to navel, cloaks clung with a chill that no fire could banish. The first task was always the same: watch the fire, or what was left of it. A ring of misery gathered around the hearth as the innkeeper's boy Gale, greasy-haired and barely conscious, jabbed at the embers with a stick, like he hoped they'd magically burst to life. Sometimes it worked. Mostly, it didn't. People stood there in silence, teeth chattering like bones in a jar, hands outstretched toward a ghost of warmth. It was the saddest ritual you could witness, the daily lottery of heat. Then came the next trial, the boots. Their shoes, stiff as corpses, had frozen overnight. Leather turned to iron. They had to be pried open, twisted, or massaged near the fire just to make them wearable. Many gave up and just forced their feet in with groans and curses. Every toe screamed, every soul went numb. One man's heel bled from the effort, and he didn't even blink. It was better than frostbite. If you still had coin, you might beg Grig for breakfast. But don't expect to feast. One chunk of bread, hard enough to chip a tooth, and a mug of ale so sour it seemed fermented in a latrine. Hot food? Don't be ridiculous. Hot stew meant fuel, and fuel meant fire. Grig saved that for evening, when the warmth business was at its peak. Morning meals were a joke. Survival, not satisfaction, was the menu. Next came the stables if you dared. The wind outside howled like a hungry beast as you pushed open the door and stepped into the snow-glazed yard. The stable stood like a shamed beast itself, hunched and rotten. Inside, your horse might still be standing or might not. Some travelers emerged to find their steed limp, coughing, or even stiff with death. Others discovered empty stalls and hoof prints vanishing into the dawn, stolen, gone, and there was no chasing a thief through a blizzard. For those lucky enough to still have their beast, the process of readying it was another trial. The saddle, left out overnight, was crusted with frost. The harnesses were brittle. Your fingers, numb and clumsy, struggled to buckle straps. The horse trembled as much as you. It was like dressing a corpse for war, both of you equally exhausted, equally cursed. Finally, there was Grig again. He never said thank you or farewell, just stood there, hand outstretched, face carved from stone, expecting payment for every misery you'd endured. The bed of rot, the inch of heat, the bread of sorrow, he charged for it all, down to the drips on your forehead, and then, with barely a grunt, he turned away and disappeared back into his den of smoke and ash. You stepped out, armorless against the cold, into another day of wandering through a world that wanted you dead. Your feet dragged, your belly hollowed, your soul weighed heavier than your pack. And what comfort did you carry with you? The knowledge that somewhere ahead, probably dozens of miles down the frozen path, another tavern waited. Maybe worse, maybe better, but never safe. There were no dreams in a place like this, no comfort, no myths of noble inns or singing hearths. That was the lie. The truth? These were arenas of survival, where men and women clawed for heat, bread, and rest like rats in a cage. Behind signs with painted wolves or drunken pigs or kings with goblets lurked a world of cold, hunger, disease, smoke, violence, and fear. The tavern wasn't a sanctuary. It was a battlefield in disguise. And yet, without them, travel would have died, trade would have frozen, soldiers would have marched no farther. They were islands of rot that kept the world turning brutal, grim, necessary. And somehow, through all that horror, the people endured. Their strength, our ancestors' strength, wasn't forged in comfort. It was beaten into them by cold mornings and mouldy bread, by cracked boots and choking smoke, by Grigg's greedy hand and Gale's dying fire. That they lived at all is astonishing. That they lived long enough to build our world? It demands respect. So if you want more brutal truths about the past, not sugar-coated legends, but raw, bone-deep reality, follow or subscribe the channel. This was just one night. There are many more ahead.